You'll have noticed I've slightly tweaked the title here. I'm going to use the term product management, let's try that one again. For the simple reason that I'm sure most people know that if you actually ask anybody for the definition of what a product manager is, of the 5 people that you ask, you'd get 5 different definitions. So I'm very deliberately going to count this presentation in terms of product management. In other words, it's not necessarily tied to the role, it's far more about what the function is and what does it mean in terms of taking a product to market. We've heard lots of, at a session like this one, we often, there's lots of technical stuff and lots of good high-level stuff, and there's always that question about, well, if you want to do a secure product, it's just a technical problem, isn't it? And I think you probably all know the answer to that one already, as you've heard from some of the other presentations, and of course, clearly it isn't. And forgive me for those who might have seen some of this presentation before, but I always pose this question, which is just the simple concept of connected product. Let's forget the IoT moniker for a second. What are we essentially talking about? Most of the products we're talking about are connected in some way or another, whether it's local area network connection, pick your wireless technology. And one of the challenges, certainly that I've seen, is organisations get into connected product, but they don't necessarily think of why would somebody hack my product. And I'll give you an example without naming an individual, but an industrial control company controlling a fairly significant piece of industrial equipment, put an Ethernet port on their controller. And the question was asked, well, what are the implications if this product in some way gets attacked through that connection? And kind of fairly blank looks around the room and they said, well, why would anybody want to hack our product? Of course the answer was, well, because you might well be a really good stepping stone to somewhere else. Of course, for those who are familiar with it, there's the great Target attack in the States where lots of credit card numbers were stolen. Not by a direct attack on the credit card system, but by the building management system. We won't talk, I'm not going to do the Gartner numbers, you've all seen them, pick your number. But certainly one of the things, and in fact in the previous panel session illustrated this so well, is Hugo from Electric Imp put the point so well, which is that particularly where you're dealing with product that's, number one, it's remote, number two, all of the things that traditional products, secure products, usually there was some degree of physical security, but now you're literally letting them out in the Wild West. And as we've seen, again, things like Mirai, they become potential weapons. So why is any of this really relevant? We've heard quite a lot of talk today about some of the challenges of taking a product to market. So in a product management sense, what are some of those challenges? You're tasked with taking a product to market. Inevitably, most modern product development is of a lean variety because that's the way the world is. And that typically might make the form of a minimal viable product, particularly in SMEs and startups who frequent the IoT space quite extensively. There's been a little bit of talk about supply chain integrity and complexity, but it really is an issue for IoT. For those, again, who were in the panel session before the break, Hugo made some very good points there about some of the challenges, particularly when you're manufacturing in Southeast Asia. And of course, for the products that weren't connected, there's always been that the traditional product role was we design it, we take it into production, we ship it. At that point, we give it to the service support people and we forget about it and we go and do the next one. And of course, IoT doesn't work like that. Suddenly now you've got these pieces in, you've got this whole raft of things that support your product. So whether you're the cloud vendor who's supporting a bunch of devices or the other way around, and that's all got to work for some significant period, particularly if you're not talking consumer. Well, we're all fairly aware of the lack of awareness, so I'm not going to insult this audience on that one. MVP tends to be, it's an incremental approach. Security is one of those ones, yeah, we'll get round to that. So no real surprises, what happens? when they're not considered. I won't go through them, you see most of them. But if we come back to, from a product management point of view, what is it that's got to be driven into the product? And it's actually the fundamentals are very simple, which is secure integrity and secure identity. There's some kind of finer points out of that, but those are really what the two critical things you have to get right. But the thing that makes IoT, and there have been some really good presentations today on the subject, is IoT affects so much more of the business than just development. It's not like a traditional business where perhaps the company's come up with a new piece of technology, they give it to engineering go away and do whatever the good stuff they do. But IoT doesn't quite work like that. It doesn't fit that model anymore, because suddenly you've got things like the supply chain. We've seen earlier today, one or two things about, possible supply chain, but it isn't just a simple case of buying some components, putting it in a product and shipping it. Again, production. Very, very few OEMs manufacture in their own facilities anymore. In fact, I can think of hardly any. And even for example, some of the traditional companies, even some of the telco equipment companies now will be they won't be manufacturing their own facilities anymore. They'll be using probably a tier 1 CEM or ODM, but they're not manufacturing their own facility. Apple's a really good example. The cloud piece, whether you outsource that or whether you do it yourself, that's got tends to be run by the operational side of the business. It doesn't necessarily want to be run by development. Is the impact on corporate communications. We'll come on to that one a little bit later. And obviously lastly, development, most of which is software supply chain. It's the one that doesn't always get talked about. Whenever somebody mentions supply chain, people tend to think of physical things that have to arrive and be delivered. But if you look at an IoT product, as there was a session in here this afternoon that illustrated so well that very few people write all of their own software anymore. It's extremely rare. Normally you buy some sort of processor, you may well buy a vendor's software components, be it bootloaders or protocol stacks. But it does prompt the question, who's doing the selection for that? Are you just simply letting development choose whatever looks like good at the time? Is there a set of requirements for that? Who's actually doing that? And if you're relying on your purchasing chain, then do they have the skill set to be able to make those kind of decisions? Or more importantly, do they actually have the authority in the organisation to be able to say, we're really not buying that one, it might be a little bit cheaper, but it doesn't meet the security requirement. The hardware supply chain is obviously fairly self-evident. We're all fairly familiar with that, I'm sure. But there's been various talk today about critical components need secure programming. There's a solution talked about this morning where you're using what in manufacturing would be considered a traditional approach of getting parts programmed offline or in the supply chain or in the distributor. But that comes with some issues, because often if you're asking for pre-programmed parts, that may well have a significant, it might well have a lead time. So if you're having to buy programmed parts and they're now not standard parts, there'll be a lead time with that. And if you've bought any components recently, some of the component lead times look fairly horrible, even to the point where you can't even buy resistors and capacitors. Anybody who's been involved with supply chain remembers the tantalum capacitor shortage, or DRAM memory, or flash parts, but it's now crazy enough, things, particularly small capacitors and resistors, are actually quite long lead time. So you've now added another, one of your major component buys. You've now not only introduced a potential lead time issue, but also MOQs. So if you're a mass volume manufacturer ordering 100,000 parts, there's no problem. But of course, if you're a smaller industrial vendor who perhaps wants to, might build 10,000 in the product life cycle, suddenly now that becomes an issue. Can you negotiate with your supplier? So then we move on to production. So in the hope that we've now selected the right software parts and we've got the right hardware, hopefully not on too long a lead time, we've got the issue now production, as we touched upon. It doesn't generally tend to get done inside ODMs or OEMs. But how do you maintain security? This one's quite a challenge. So things like cryptographic keys, how do you get keys? We've heard various people talk about it. I mean, if you go back to the mobile phone world, often that might have involved deploying hardware security modules on a production line. That's okay if you're a fairly major cellular vendor, but if you're perhaps an SME, the idea that you've got to try and deploy HSMs on a production line and manage them, particularly if that might involve them being in Southeast Asia, and then all the issues of, have you got access to them? Could you recover them? What happens if the relationship goes bad with the manufacturer? Symmetric keys obviously are very problematic, just simply because they're symmetric. How do you actually get them into devices in a facility that isn't yours? Now, when you've got the kind of clout that Apple have got, you can have your own room inside Foxconn, that's okay. But for most organisations, that just isn't a reality. Now, there are ways around this. One of the favourite ones might be that you buy a part from a vendor that's perhaps already got an asymmetric key in it, and you use the asymmetric key as a way of pushing the symmetric keys into the device. But what I'm trying to illustrate here, at least in terms of from a product management point of view, is this is no longer a straightforward new product introduction. This is no longer a bill of materials and some firmware going to a factory and products popping out the end of the production line some weeks later. Suddenly now there's actually a deployment piece. And in fact, I thought Hugo from Electric Imp provided some very good insights into that, as to why you may well want to think about, do you actually want to try and engineer this stuff, or do you actually want to buy it from a platform vendor who's actually already done some of that heavy lifting, and some of it's not inconsequential. Often gets talked about, unfortunately, sadly, to do with the region, but things like unauthorised product, where you're actually sure that the keys that are being issued, for example, are only to the right devices and only to the correct number. And obviously things like, is it authorised data, etc., going to get put onto the product? And based on my past experience of putting all of this kind of stuff in femtocells, one of the things that I actually had a small engineering team to do this, but we spent quite a bit of time making sure that there were no HSMs on the production line, and in fact the majority of the key deployment actually took place after the product left the factory. It was post-deployment credential delivery. But that was actually that was at one point, that was probably 8 engineers. So for most organisations it's not enormous, but it still carries a price tag. That was in the telco world. Fortunately, there was sufficient budget to be able to support that kind of effort. But if you're an SME, where it might be that your actual main software team is 8 engineers, suddenly turning around to the CTO and the CEO and saying, by the way, I want to double the engineering team because I want to do that kind of stuff, is clearly going to raise some eyebrows. There's the inevitable cloud piece. Now, obviously, I'm not going to spell out the classic product management piece of do you make or do you buy. And clearly, that's something that's very important for any product management process: is are you going to make or are you going to buy? There are clearly pros and cons, not least of which is things like customer data. Is it going to get stored by the cloud provider? That may in itself create issues, or do you want to create a flow through? Do you want to design it in such a way that perhaps it may be that your customers may actually want the data from themselves, and that actually all you're doing is acting as the ingress point, and then actually delivering on to your customers and their various data centres? And there may well be good reasons to do that, particularly when you've got to worry about some of the geographic issues to do with customer data. For example, you'll certainly find that the EU tends to get quite sensitive about personally identifiable data and where it goes, and it far prefers that it stays within the EU. And that what you have to remember is that as soon as you start moving that kind of data outside of the EU, the data centre that it's just turned up in now effectively falls under EU law, despite the fact it may not reside inside the EU. We won't get into the politics of whether or not we should be in the EU. That's definitely one for outside of this room. But nonetheless, the other thing to remember is also that particularly putting European nationals' data in American data centres is definitely problematic. For those who don't know, there are certain American acts of law which in effect mean that the American government can ask for information about that individual because they're an alien, and the alien in question is not in any way to be notified. So that kind of thing can, particularly with some European customers, particularly if they're larger corporate customers, that question will almost certainly arrive. In fact, it was one of the drivers, I think, why Microsoft decided that they really did need to bring up a data centre in the UK for Azure for that reason. One of the other ones we'll touch on in a minute is how a product key is securely deployed. This seems to be a bit of a hot topic at the moment. So customer data, covered a little bit of that. Obviously there's various talk about EU GDPR. And things like, do you need to anonymise data? Is it necessary that you anonymise the data because, as Uber found out, it might be anonymised, but if you suddenly start finding out that pickups take place at certain particular times, it's amazing what you can extrapolate back from the data. And of course that's something that EU GDPR very much tends to want to encourage organisations to think about, that they can't be quite so cavalier perhaps, is perhaps an overstatement, but need to really think about what does that data get used to? Is it used for? Is it going to get used in the way it's intended? The classic one, where are my keys? So here's a question, do you manage your own keys? Or do you let your cloud provider manage your keys? Self-managed keys, obviously there's more effort involved. You may well need to actually do the lifecycle management. So that may involve HSM deployment. That might involve deploying HSMs in data centres, not necessarily your own. There's then the question of who has access, how can you recover them, what happens if you don't pay the bill, can you go in and get your HSMs out? Because the thing to remember about particularly server keys is typically they're proof of your identity. So if you want to look at it another way, you're managing your passport. So I don't know about anybody else in the room, but if I were to hand my passport to somebody, I think I'd want to be fairly careful who I was handing it to, and also to know that there were some fairly good ways that I'd actually get the passport back. The alternative then, of course, is if you're managing those keys, how do you make them available to your service provider? So assume for a second that your service provider is terminating secure connections for you, then there may well be the logistics of perhaps doing network cross-connects to enable your service provider to be able to access your HSMs to be able to terminate your traffic. So it's not rocket science, but it's not necessarily straightforward. So of course the alternative is just to say, well that's easy, we'll just, hey, it's all right, we'll just outsource it. It's always the solution, just outsource it. But it was mentioned this morning, you can't outsource risk. So suddenly now, does that mean that if you've now handed your passport, if you will, to a third party, are you now in a supplier lock-in scenario? Does that effectively, is that a way of locking you into the platform? Do you need to consider key escrow? So that, for example, it is very clear that if, for example, the cloud provider in question ever went out of business or was unable to trade, there would be a way of you being able to retrieve your keys without too much legal encumbrance. So the thing to keep in mind with that one is your supplier is now managing your identity. Ongoing support, again, as we mentioned earlier, the classic traditional product model, again, ship the product. Yes, you might need to provide you might need to provide some software patches, but typically that might not have been online. So one of the things, again, from a product management point of view, is what does this ongoing support package look like? And is there a requirement to deliver security patches in a particular time frame? So that in itself can often be, that involves and may well involve with some of your customers. That could actually be quite a significant piece of contractual work. You might even find that, particularly in the industrial sector, you might find that somebody actually wants to actually have some contractual obligation to you, or that you're going to deliver updates at an appropriate time. The majority of products I think we've seen are patchable, but inevitably some of the very low power sensors, for example, are not. And that then obviously prompts the question, if they're not patchable, then what do you do if there is a vulnerability discovered? What is the policy for that? What is the intended service life? At the moment, and the Foundation of course has done a lot of focus on consumer product, but if you start looking in the industrial sector, product life cycles are 10, 15, 25 years life. So as was illustrated earlier, you've now got the issues not just of can you provide the software patches to be able to patch those platforms, but, and this is certainly pertinent to a world I used to live in FPGAs, which is in, I don't know about anybody else, but if you look at the operating systems that you might even compile the software on, I know I would have a struggle recompiling some of the FPGAs I designed 20 years ago. Our software's not quite as bad, thankfully, as some of the hardware design software, but it's still nonetheless an issue that if you suddenly hit an issue in 20 years' time, could you even rebuild that software? Never mind whether you could deliver it, but could you actually rebuild it? So that in itself is again something that's a support cost. Can you actually keep being able to deliver software? And obviously the whole end of life kill switch. If you can't patch it, what do you do? Do you kill it? How are your customers going to feel about that one? There may be some customers who might even be prepared to live with a vulnerability, and they may not want you to turn that product off. So what I'm trying to illustrate here, at least from a product management perspective, is that connected product suddenly makes what supporting a traditional product was, I'm not going to say very straightforward, but relatively straightforward. Suddenly now this is dragging in quite a long tail. And if you're looking to launch a product, I would recommend that you would seriously have got answers for certainly all of those before you actually go and launch. The one the financial director always dreads, product recall. The hardware department usually aren't too happy about it either, because usually there's some scapegoating goes on as to who designed that then. But on a serious note, product recall in a way is actually one of the, and I don't mean this from a fear and uncertainty or doubt point of view, but actually why should security be any different when it comes to, in the context of product recall? Usually the major reason that you would see in traditional product for product recall is safety. We've all seen the advert in the newspaper. Tumble dryer has certain problem, needs to get fixed. Please get in touch with the manufacturer and they'll send a nice engineer around to fix it. And the possibilities for security, if for example the hardware root of trust got compromised in your product, or as we've seen already, there's actually plenty of products out there already that don't even have a strong hardware root of trust. What are the implications for product recall? So the idea that suddenly the BOM cost is really cheap might not actually make any sense anymore. Saving 20 cents, even on 1 million units, might actually be a very small price to pay against the product recall. And the example I love to give of this one was a case study I did recently for a company where they were putting sensors in some fairly inaccessible places. Now this was quite different from the consumer product I've worked on in the past, where, all right, consumer product recall, it's problematic, you've obviously got expectation management, but at the end of the day, you can always send a nice man with FedEx with a new one and swap it out, and you can do a doorstep swap out. And in fact, there's a number of vendors who will do that. But if you suddenly got a sensor on the top of a building that might even have been embedded in concrete, suddenly now the costs to recall that product now suddenly might even make the actual BOM cost of the unit look almost insignificant. So this for me is one of the major arguments for making the case for security, in the same way that you put things in your product to make sure that they're safe. There's a really good example with the iKettle. They've put that piece of hardware in that says, never mind what the software thinks, if this device goes over a certain temperature, it will switch off in hardware. And in the same way, I would make the case that why should security be any different? Why would you risk your corporate brand and probably a significant chunk of your bottom line if you don't actually spend that little bit more money? And often the types of cost increment are actually not that large. I mean, typical price of a good reputable crypto chip sit alongside your microcontroller, probably about 18, 19 cents in volume. Versus the cost of having to recall a whole bunch of units, that looks cheap. And I say that as having been involved with a recall of femtocells, for those who don't know, miniature 3G base stations. And there are parallels with IoT, because in the early days the standards were evolving, there were a number of competing standards, it was a classic Betamax VHS for those who can remember back that far. And the security standards evolved, and it got to the point where some of the early generations of femtocell just didn't simply have the security. And fortunately for the company I worked for at the time, the mobile operators they didn't lay the liability with us. They just said, look, we knew what we were buying, we knew the state of the standards at the time, we're not going to look to recover that cost from you, but we want to end of life these devices, and we want you to support us in turning them off in your management systems. And that was 60,000 units. So I can draw from that parallel, albeit nearly 10 years ago now, but it has distinct parallels with IoT today. So it's something to keep in mind, that if you go and ship a load of product out today and it's really not fit for purpose, guess what? It might come back. I can see I've got Craig in the audience with a subject close to his heart. Is a vulnerability policy in place? And as for those who were in the Kelvin Theatre before the break, certainly a novel situation for me, having a security researcher and the vendor on the same platform. That's not been my experience in the past. But certainly my experience is, if you haven't got a security vulnerability policy in place and your senior management are not prepared for one day the email comes into whatever account it might come into, but probably not security at XYZ Corp, is your management team, and particularly your executive team, ready for the security researcher who says, I found a vulnerability in your product? So obviously I don't want to do too big a plug today. This isn't a sales pitch, but obviously the Working Group 4, of which Craig is the chair, has done a very good white paper on that subject. So I would encourage anybody, if you're not already familiar with it, that's a good place to start, both in terms of I should explain we've changed the licensing, so you can now use some of the boilerplate in that. All we ask is you attribute it. I'm going to skim through some of these. So in terms of post-product launch, we've covered some of that, at the risk of plagiarising a couple of Craig's slides. Philips was a very good example of how it was successfully managed. The researchers went and talked to Philips, Philips got them fixed, and the issues were resolved. Product development. One of the things that IoT really does illustrate is it's a system, and systems tend to need requirements. And I probably don't need to make the point, but there's no such thing as software security. And it is the old thing about the weakest link. And we're back to this issue that if you can't fix it because it's a hardware problem, then you're back to that issue of product recall. I'm not going to dwell on that one, but obviously, again, you've got to move beyond product life cycles that we're familiar with in our pocket of a cell phone that might be good for a couple of years. Touched a little bit on this one. It's a favourite one. It's a good job Chris has got his earphones on and he's watching the camera, because this is a favourite topic that we pick up in some of the working groups. Often discussions take place over, is it an 8-bit micro or is it a 32-bit micro? And the usual one, of course, is, well, the 8-bit micro is cheaper. But the question comes back to, can you actually afford to save the money on the 8-bit? Now that discussion I know will run and run. I'm not going to try and run that one out today, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point. Do you leave that to your engineering team, or shouldn't that actually be a business decision? Because it's actually unfair on the development team just to say develop it at the lowest cost, because you're actually not doing a cost-benefit analysis. The other one particularly is things like dedicated key storage devices. One of the favourite ones, particularly if you leave engineers to do key management, then don't ask them where they last left that USB key with the key on, because you won't like the answer. So again, these are the kind of things that they need to be driven in terms of requirements. And that's both for development's benefit, but it's also for the business's benefit. So forgive me, I am going to do a small plug for the ITSF, but I'm going to turn it slightly on its head, which is, we've tended to talk about the framework as a framework almost as though something that we apply to products afterwards. You know, we've let the horse bolt, and then we say, right, okay, so does this product fit this framework? And I would actually encourage you to look at the framework actually the other way round, which is actually what it is it's a set of product requirements. And we all know that there's lots of security material out there, but there's very few, in fact I think I'm right in saying there are very few, that would actually give you a set of requirements that you could give to the various parts of the organisation and say, we want to launch a connected product, and here's a set of frameworks, here's a set of requirements that each part of the business, and it's why the framework is separated in the sections it is. You've at least got something in the way of requirements that you can give to the different parts of the business, and they've actually got something to work with. So at this point, Chris reminds me that I've got a couple of minutes for questions, but really the message I wanted to give today was that's a very fast walk through a product management view of launching a secure product. And what I'm trying to illustrate, not that I've shared anything, I don't think there's anything particularly groundbreaking in there, but what I'm really trying to illustrate is that a product, anybody who has the role of product management, I'm not going to use the term product manager, but anybody who is product managing a connected product is to illustrate that it's a lot more than saying it's a box with pink spots on and we're going to ship it next week. And that actually you've got to think about how that product will affect the whole of the organisation and not just being able to ship it out the door. So at this point I think I've got a minute or so for questions. Chris, thanks. Any questions?